Hi everyone, Megan here, and today I'm going to share with you my top 10 books of 2019. So this is not going to include rereads, just those books that I've read for the first time in 2019. Now, something interesting I noticed about this is that 6 of the 10 books are nonfiction. Now, I did read a fair amount of nonfiction, especially in the first half of the year, and then I read a little bit in the second half, but it's surprising how many of these nonfiction books have stuck with me more than the fiction books. So, I mean, there's still 4 really good fiction books on this list, but I just thought that was interesting because I've never thought of myself as a huge nonfiction reader. But looking back on my year and on my favorites, I realized I do like nonfiction more than I thought. It also showed me, again, how much I love World War II stories, and also how much I love Lucy Maud Montgomery and Louisa May Alcott. So let's jump into this list. I will start with number 10. Number 10 is one of those wonderful World War II books, and that is The Nazi Officer's Wife by Edith Hahn Beer, How One Jewish Woman Survived the Holocaust. So this is one of the nonfiction books. It was written by this woman that it's about. The Nazi officer's wife and her daughter helped her write it. So this is a true story. She was a Jewish woman and she managed to marry a Nazi officer and survive the war because of that. It is definitely not the most gory or violent World War II book I've read. It kind of, in a way, I like that because sometimes it's a little less intense, but it still is an intense story in a way because she's hiding out. She's waiting to be, discovered throughout this whole book, and so it's beautifully written. It's really good to get another story, another angle on the Holocaust, and to be reminded of how horrific that was. Number 9 is another kind of World War II based book, and it's also nonfiction, and it is Forgiveness by Mark Sakamoto. Now, this is such an interesting story. It's about, so Mark, he's, I guess he's probably in his 40s now. He wrote this book based on his family's history. So his grandfather on his mother's side fought in World War II for the Canadians. And he was actually taken prisoner and was horribly mistreated in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Now, on his father's side, his parents were taken out of their homes in BC. So in parts of BC, especially along the coast, Japanese Canadians were ripped out of their homes and were sent to these internment camps because the Canadian government was worried that they were spies. So it's absolutely horrific. They forced them to live in chicken coops, chicken houses. That's where his grandparents and father lived, was in this chicken house, freezing, absolutely freezing, -50 weather, and they're living in a place that has no heating. It was just terrible. So both sides of his family experienced these awful atrocities, and then they managed to find this beautiful forgiveness. His parents married, his grandparents, the two sides, they showed so much love and care for each other. So it was a beautiful story, very unique story. I absolutely loved it, and I would highly recommend it. Well, we are sticking with nonfiction for number 8, and that is Eden's Outcasts by John Madison. This is the story of Louisa May Alcott and her father, Bronte Alcott. Such a good book. Read this for the Louisa May 2020 read-along. You can still join us if you'd like to. We've only read 2 months so far, but man, this was a good book. I think probably my favorite part was seeing how Louisa's life related to her books. What exactly was true about Little Women? What inspired those events in her books? And it was also just really neat to see Bronte's philosophy, how that affected Louisa, and then how that affected her work. Another thing that I really liked about this book was how they talked about Louisa May Alcott's mental health. She most likely had bipolar disorder, and her father, Bronte, probably had something similar as well. So that was really interesting to explore that angle, because we often, you read her books and you can tell she knows something about mental health, but doesn't have our language that we use today. So it was really cool to get to discover more about that from a modern writer, from modern research. Okay, now we're gonna switch over to fiction for number 7. Yes, number 7, and that is Betsy and the Great World by Maud Hart Lovelace. I loved doing the Betsy Tacy read-along this past year, hosted by Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading and Kate Howe. I just really enjoyed it, and I especially liked Betsy and the Great World. We got to go to Europe with Betsy, and she was living the life. Like, I think that's the main reason why I loved it, because she was over traveling in Europe. She, didn't have to worry about expenses. She basically lived in these cities. She'd live in one place for a few months and then move on to the next place and live there for a few months. And it's like, man, I would love to do that. She didn't have to take time off work. She didn't have to go through all that. She could just go for months. I also really liked how it took place right before World War I. And this was when Maud Hart Lovelace's trip happened, I believe, because it's based on her life. So it was very interesting, the rush to get out of Europe, to get back to the US when England joined the war. All right, so now we're going back to nonfiction for number 6. Now I'm kind of cheating here. These are 2. But I kind of count them as 1. They are 2 of the journals of L.M. Montgomery. These are so interesting. They are deep. They are packed filled with details. Some of these journal entries are they are taken exactly from her journals and put into her books, like Rill of Ingleside, for example. So interesting. Just fascinating. I was underlining like crazy. It took me forever to read these because I was just underlining and writing notes in the margins, and my goodness, they were absolutely fascinating. It was so cool to actually read her words about her life. We're not reading about somebody else's interpretation of her life. We're reading about her interpretation of her life. And now part of it is unreliable, because obviously she's a person. She has her biases, so she is unreliable. But not only that, she went back and rewrote a lot of her journals later after she became famous. So you never really know, is this something that she wrote originally, or is this something that she rewrote? But that's also a very interesting question to have going on as you're reading it. Now, continuing on with nonfiction and with L.M. Montgomery, I read House of Dreams, The Life of L.M. Montgomery by Liz Rosenberg. Now, I actually read this before the journals, which I think was a good idea because I kind of got a nice overview of her life that was told in a very interesting way, so I understood who the people were. I understood what was going on when I read the journals. And another thing that was really great about reading this before the journals is that this is more of an unbiased opinion. So there, for example, there is one part where Lucy, or Maud, as she liked to be called, excuse me, where Maud is carrying on with a man who is engaged, and she herself is engaged. And in the journals, Ella Montgomery frames it as this beautiful romance, this passion that could not be controlled. But when you read House of Dreams, Liz Rosenberg says, this is how Maud was feeling, but really, they were just both acting badly. Like, they should have, obviously they shouldn't have been cheating. They should have broken up or, with their fiancés, or they should have moved on. Like, they were acting badly. So I really did appreciate this more non-biased look. Also, isn't that a gorgeous cover? It's so beautiful. They shelve it at the children's section a lot, but it's actually not a children's book. Like, it's not explicit, but it does go into detail that I don't think, young kids should be reading. Let's see, so these are kind of the style of drawings. They're really kind of whimsical and fun. I do really enjoy that. As you get to a new chapter, there's a new drawing, and that's a very Anne of Green Gables kind of drawing there. So yes, I loved it. Oh, so good. Okay, back to fiction. Here's a book that I read for Victober, which I thought I would like, but I didn't think I would like this much, and I love it. And it is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. So I've now read one book from each Bronte. I've read Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Wuthering Heights, and Jane Eyre. And I've read Jane Eyre a few times. But this is my favorite Bronte book so far. Anne Bronte is my favorite Bronte, and she's so underrated. I'm gonna read Agnes Grey sometime in 2020, and I'm gonna finish reading Charlotte's novels as well. And of course, Emily only wrote the one. She wrote poetry too, but I'm not huge on poetry. But it was just so good. Like, it's a proto-feminist work, so it was really interesting to have Anne Bronte speaking on the injustices and the abuse that women were going through and the lack of power. Like, women were literally the property of their husbands. So, it was just so interesting to see her talk about that and to show what a woman does when she's in an impossible situation. Another thing that I thought was very interesting about this is that even though this book is, it's a classic, it's old, it is still so relatable to today. Like, a lot of what especially one of the characters when she's younger, a lot of what she was going through, you could see that she was falling into a trap. And I see, like, I've gone through this with my friends. I've seen them fall into that same trap. And it's so interesting to see how timeless some of these problems are that this book explores. So, it was beautiful and heartbreaking, of course, but just really, really beautiful. Guess what, guys? We are back to nonfiction, and we are back to Ella Montgomery, and you can go back and watch this video. That I made a whole video on this book. It is Ella Montgomery and War, edited by Andrea Mackenzie and Jane Ledwell. So this is a collection of essays from different people on different aspects of Ella Montgomery and war. This was just so powerful. Like it helped me understand her work better, where she was coming from, like what the war meant to her. Especially when you read Real of Ingleside, you get to read the background of what was going on in her life that made her write Real of Ingleside. And it's so fun. It's got all these pictures in here. Here's the propaganda poster in color. So another thing that I liked about this book is that it compares the Real of Ingleside series, the Real of Ingleside book, which is about Anne's daughter when she is about 14 at the start of World War I. And they talk about a similar series about a young girl coming of age in World War I, except it's from the German perspective. A German author wrote this during World War I. And so they kind of compare and contrast those two things, and it is fascinating. This book, I just ate it up. Like, I just underlined and starred things and wrote all over it. It was really good. I highly recommend this book because I think a lot of people, when they think Ella Montgomery, they just think, oh, Anne of Green Gables, happy, cozy, wonderful, like Edwardian, beautiful pieces, when really, like, she was obsessed with war. When World War I came along, she was obsessed with it. And then when World War II came along, again, obsessed with it. She wrote about war quite a bit in her journals, in Real of Ingleside, in the Blythes are quoted. She really was so focused on that. That was such a huge part of her life. So I think it's really good that there is this book honoring her and showing that she really was, like, this is something that Ella Montgomery stands out for. She is the only Canadian contemporary woman who wrote about World War I. So, in other words, she was the only woman during World War I who was writing about World War I in Canada. Now, I'm sure she wasn't the only one writing about it, but she was the only one who had books published on it. So she has something important to say, and I highly recommend this book. Even if you haven't even really read any of her books, I would recommend reading this book. Okay, guys, now for a very recent read. This is Mr. Churchill's Secretary by Susan Elia McNeill, and this is part of the Maggie Hope Mysteries. It is so good. I've read the first two now. This is the first one. They are so good. They're similar to Maisie Dobbs, which I absolutely love as well. And really, Maisie Dobbs should be on this series too. On this top 10s list as well. But the reason why I chose this one is because what I really love about this series is that real people, real historical figures are in this series, even though it's a fictional series. So she is a typist for Mr. Churchill, for Winston Churchill. And then in the second book, we see a lot of our present Queen Elizabeth, except she's Princess Elizabeth at that time. So I just love the realism that is blended with the fiction. It's so good. Maggie is such an admirable character. She's not perfect, but she is pretty awesome. And the stories are just so thrilling and suspenseful. There's a bit of romance in there. It just kept me turning the pages as fast as I could. Okay, now for my number one book of 2019. Da, 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 da. It's Christie by Catherine Marshall. Now, Sarah, my sister, bought a really nice edition of Christie for me, and I'm so thankful to her because it's a beautiful book, and this is a terrible cover. But unfortunately, Sarah hasn't had a chance to give it to me yet because we don't live in the same town. So you're seeing my ugly cover instead. Oh well. But yes, so thank you, Sarah, for buying that for me. Actually, a few of the books on this list I was given as gifts from Sarah Hannett, my sister. She has a channel, and Naomi from Naomi's Bookshelf. And Naomi's my cousin. So that's kind of funny. They obviously know my tastes, but Christie is so good. It's this woodsy, rich atmosphere. It's just gorgeous. I love so Christie is this young woman who is going to be a missionary to a very underprivileged community that's really quite poverty stricken. So she is going there to be a teacher, and she has to learn to be unselfish and serve these people and also not be prejudiced, but to learn that she can learn a lot from them. So, and there's a bit of romance. I love her relationship with her students. She mentors them. She's mentored by Miss Alice. I love her relationship with Fairlight, one of the mountain women. It's a gorgeous story. I absolutely love it. I highly, highly recommend it. Those are my top 10 books of 2019. They are all marvelous. I'll link any videos below where I talked about those books in previous videos. And yeah, tell me what your favorite books of 2019 were. I would love to hear. And I guess that's all. So may you all be filled with peace, hope, love, and joy. So take care, everyone. Bye.